The scent of time clung to Alara Vance's fingertips, a dry, sweet perfume of decaying paper, brittle leather, and forgotten ink. In the quiet solitude of her small restoration workshop, tucked away on a cobblestone alley in Philadelphia, she was a keeper of silent histories. Her world was measured in the delicate turn of a fragile page, the meticulous application of conservation paste, and the patient mending of spines broken by centuries. At 22, her hands, steady and precise, knew the intimate textures of vellum and parchment better than they knew the touch of another person. She poured all the tenderness she possessed into these inanimate objects, breathing life back into stories that had long gone silent. It was a careful, controlled existence, a stark contrast to the chaotic, unwritten narrative of her own heart, which lay dormant and unread, a volume she was too afraid to open. If you want to know what forces a woman this careful to risk everything, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you are watching from. We continue. Alara was a creature of soft edges and quiet observation, her slight frame often lost in the oversized smock she wore to protect her clothes from dust and glue. Her eyes, the color of faded denim, held a depth that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, mirroring the muted tones of her surroundings. This workshop was both her sanctuary and her cage. Within its dusty walls, she was a master, her skill undeniable. But beyond the door, the vibrant, noisy world felt alien and overwhelming. Her life had been whittled down to this single, focused purpose, leaving no room for the spontaneous joys or messy heartaches of youth. She existed in a state of suspended animation. A character paused mid-sentence, waiting for an author who had seemingly abandoned her tale. Her virginity was not a statement of faith or a conscious moral decision, but rather a quiet, unremarked casualty of her circumstances. It was a consequence of a life lived in service to others, specifically to her younger sister, whose fragile health had been the singular focus of Alara's world since adolescence. The years that should have been filled with clumsy first dates, stolen kisses, and the thrilling exploration of desire had instead been consumed by hospital waiting rooms, pharmacy runs, and the gnawing anxiety of medical bills. Romance was a luxury she couldn't afford, a language she had never learned to speak. Her body, like her dreams, remained an undiscovered country, its borders defined by duty and a profound, paralyzing shyness born from a life lived in the shadows. The silence of the workshop was a deceptive thing. It was never truly empty. It thrummed with the ghosts of the novels she repaired, tales of sweeping romance, desperate courage, and lives lived with a ferocious passion that made her own feel pale and insignificant. As she carefully stitched a binding or cleaned a faded illustration, she would lose herself in those other worlds. She felt the sting of a heroine's betrayal, the thrill of a forbidden love, the ache of a noble sacrifice. These vicarious emotions were her only outlet, a temporary escape from the crushing monotony of her reality, but they always left a residue of longing, a painful awareness of the chasm between the vibrant lives pressed into the pages and the unlived ones she held in her own hands. The source of her sacrifice was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that underscored every moment of her day. It was the weight of her sister's rare illness, a relentless condition that demanded not just emotional fortitude but a staggering financial toll. The debt was a living entity, a predator that had stalked her family for years, devouring their savings, their home's equity, and their peace of mind. Alara's work, once a passion, had become a desperate, unending battle against this tide. Every dollar she earned from restoring a wealthy client's prized possession was a drop in an ocean of need. This relentless pressure had forged her into someone prematurely old, her shoulders perpetually tensed, carrying a burden far too heavy for her slender frame. One afternoon, a new project arrived, a set of heavy, leather-bound ledgers from an old Philadelphia dynasty, the Thorns. The name was whispered in the city with a mixture of awe and fear. As Alara's fingers traced the elegant, ruthless script detailing acquisitions and mergers from a bygone era, she felt a strange chill. It was a glimpse into a world of unimaginable power and cold, calculated ambition, a universe away from her own, which was governed by compassion and sacrifice. The sheer scale of the wealth recorded in those pages felt obscene, an affront to the daily struggle her family endured. She felt like an archaeologist unearthing the bones of a predator, both repulsed and morbidly fascinated by the evidence of its immense, unyielding strength. As twilight bled through the grimy panes of the workshop window, Ilara finally set down her tools. The city outside began to glitter, its towering skyscrapers piercing the bruised purple sky like shards of glass. Each light represented a life, a story, a world of choice and possibility that felt entirely inaccessible to her. She stood motionless, caught between the dead histories on her workbench and the living ones she could only watch from a distance. A profound sense of being trapped settled over her, as heavy and suffocating as the dust in the air. She was a perfectly preserved artifact in her own life, beautiful and untouched, but slowly, inexorably, turning to dust. She didn't know it yet, but the name in the ledger she'd touched today was not a ghost of the past, but a harbinger of a future that would shatter her carefully constructed world. The Vance family lived in a narrow brick row house in South Philadelphia, a home that seemed to be perpetually sighing under the weight of its own history. The air inside was a thick tapestry of competing scents, the faint, ever-present odor of boiled cabbage from the kitchen, the sharp, antiseptic tang of medical supplies from her sister's room, and the damp, earthy smell of an old house that could never quite shake the city's humidity. Every floorboard creaked with a familiar complaint. Every faucet dripped with a steady, maddening rhythm. It was a world away from the silent, climate-controlled sanctity of her workshop. Here decay was not a delicate art to be reversed, but a relentless, encroaching reality. This house was the physical embodiment of their struggle, cramped, worn, and holding on by a thread, a cage built of love and necessity. Her father, Arthur Vance, was a man slowly being erased by worry. Once broad-shouldered and quick to laugh, he now seemed to fold in on himself, shrinking with every new bill that arrived. Ilara would find him at the worn linoleum kitchen table late at night, a single dim bulb illuminating the battlefield of invoices and final notices spread before him. He'd stare at the numbers as if trying to decipher an ancient, malevolent code, his hands trembling slightly as he held his pen. He rarely spoke of the debt directly to her, but his silence was louder than any confession. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of shame and despair that he wrapped around himself, and in his averted eyes, Ilara saw not just a father's failure, but the terrifying foreshadowing of a desperate man considering impossible solutions. Lily, her younger sister, was the quiet, fragile heart of their home. Her bedroom was a sanctuary and a prison, its walls adorned with her vibrant, whimsical drawings from a healthier time, a stark contrast to the sterile gleam of the IV stand and the rhythmic puffing of the nebulizer in the corner. At 19, Lily possessed a wisdom that belied her years, her gaze often distant, lost in a world her body could no longer inhabit. Ilara's days were bookended by the rituals of Lily's care, crushing pills into applesauce, reading aloud until her voice grew hoarse, and gently brushing the hair that had thinned from medications. This constant, tender service was an act of fierce love, but it was also an anchor, mooring Ilara to this life of quiet sacrifice, her own future, an unwritten page she had no time to fill. The daily bus ride to her workshop was a silent, painful pilgrimage through a world that was not her own. As the vehicle rumbled from the gritty familiarity of her neighborhood toward the polished stone and gleaming glass of the city center, Ilara became an invisible observer. She watched girls her own age, their faces bright with laughter and easy confidence, texting on their phones, discussing plans for the weekend, their lives stretching before them with infinite, casual possibility. A dull, hollow ache would settle in her chest. She felt like a ghost haunting the edges of their reality, a black-and-white photograph in a world of vibrant color. The glass of the bus window acted as a permanent barrier, reflecting her own pale, serious face back at her, a constant reminder of the life she was watching instead of living. Family dinners had become exercises in quiet desperation, the clinking of cutlery against chipped plates the only consistent sound. Conversation was a minefield of avoided topics. They never spoke of the future, only of the immediate present. Lily's next doctor's appointment, the rising cost of groceries, a leak in the roof that would have to wait. The unspoken weight of their financial ruin was a palpable presence at the table, making the simple food taste of ash and anxiety. Ilara would watch her parents exchange fleeting, panicked glances over her sister's head, their love for their children entangled with the crushing fear that they could no longer protect them. In these moments, the house felt less like a home, and more like a sinking ship, and they were all just silently, grimly, going down with it. Sometimes, in the dead of night when the house was finally still, a memory would surface unbidden, sharp and painful in its sweetness. She'd remember a summer afternoon years ago, before the illness had a name, before their lives were measured in dosages and deductibles. The four of them were in Fairmount Park, Lily, small and vibrant, chasing butterflies with a ferocity that made them all laugh. Her father had lifted her onto his shoulders, his laughter booming and genuine, and her mother had looked on with a smile of pure, uncomplicated joy. The memory was like a shard of glass in her heart, a glimpse of a life that had been stolen from them, a reminder of everything she was now fighting to preserve, even if it meant sacrificing the last remnants of herself in the process. The tipping point arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a crisp, windowed envelope with an aggressive red banner across the top. It was a final notice of foreclosure. Elara found it in the mail stack before her father did, her fingers going numb as she read the legalistic, unforgiving prose. The words swam before her eyes. Accelerated debt, immediate seizure, vacate the premises. The abstract monster of their debt had finally shown its face, and it was standing on their doorstep. A cold, paralyzing dread seized her. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the imminent collapse of their entire world. The walls of their small brick house, which had long felt like a prison, now felt like the only shelter she had ever known, and it was about to be ripped away. That night, she overheard them. Her parents' voices were hushed, frantic whispers seeping from behind their closed bedroom door. They thought she and Lily were asleep. She heard her mother's choked sobs and her father's voice, rough with a despair she had never heard before. They spoke of bankruptcy as a final, shameful death knell. And then her father spoke a name, his tone a mixture of deep reluctance and last-ditch hope. "The Thorns," he'd said. There was that old agreement, with Julian Thorne's grandfather, a debt of honor. The name landed in the silent hallway like a stone. It wasn't the name of a client from our workshop. It was spoken like a prayer to a dark, powerful god, a name attached to a final, unthinkable gambit. A chilling realization washed over Elara as she stood motionless in the darkened hall. The cold, ruthless history she'd been handling in the Thorn ledgers was not a relic of the past. It was a living, breathing power that was about to intersect with her own fragile existence. The unimaginable wealth documented in that spidery script, the accounts of fortunes built and empires crushed, was suddenly, terrifyingly personal. She felt a profound sense of cosmic injustice, that a man like Julian Thorne could possess a world of such immense power, while her family was suffocating under the weight of a debt that would be a rounding error to him. She was no longer just a restorer of his family's history, she was about to become a footnote in it. The next evening, her father approached her in the living room. The rest of the house was quiet, the air thick with unspoken tension. He couldn't meet her eyes, instead fixing his gaze on a framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a picture of a smiling, healthy Lily from a lifetime ago. His face was a ravaged landscape of shame, desperation, and a grim, paternal resolve. He didn't have to speak the words. Elara saw the proposition reflected in his tormented expression. He was about to ask her to trade her future for her sister's, to sacrifice her body and her soul on the altar of their family's survival. In that silent, agonizing moment, she understood the true nature of her cage. It had no bars, only love and duty, and its door was about to be locked for good. The Thorn Tower was not a building. It was a statement of conquest. A shard of smoked glass and obsidian steel that sliced the Philadelphia skyline, it existed in a different atmosphere from the city below. The elevator ascended in unnerving silence, a pressurized capsule lifting Elara from her world of tangible history into an abstract realm of digital power and immense, sterile wealth. When the doors opened onto the penthouse floor, she stepped not into an office, but into a void. The space was a cavern of minimalist design, all sharp angles, polished black marble, and a single panoramic window that turned the sprawling city into a silent, conquered map. It was the perch of a predator, designed to diminish everything outside its walls, including the small, trembling woman who now stood at its center, feeling utterly and terrifyingly out of place. Her worn but clean cotton dress felt like a peasant's rags in this temple of cold ambition. The air itself was different, scrubbed clean of life, carrying only the faint chemical scent of new leather and the cold hum of hidden technology. There was no dust here, no comforting smell of decaying paper, no soul. A severe-looking woman with a headset had led her to the center of the room and vanished as silently as she appeared, leaving Elara alone with the suffocating silence and the dizzying view. She clutched the strap of her simple leather satchel, the worn material a desperate anchor to her own reality. She felt like one of her own antique books, brought from a quiet shelf into a harsh, unforgiving light, her fragile binding and faded ink exposed for brutal assessment. He was there all along, a shadow against the light. Julian Thorne did not rise to greet her. He sat behind a monolithic black desk that seemed carved from a single piece of solidified night, his back partially to her as he stared at a bank of glowing screens. He moved with a deliberate, unnerving economy, his fingers tapping a command onto a keyboard with the finality of a judge's gavel. When he finally swiveled his chair, the motion was slow, controlled, and utterly dismissive. He was dressed in a suit so impeccably tailored, it seemed more like an exoskeleton than clothing, his features sharp and severe. But it was his eyes that seized her breath. They were the color of a winter storm, intelligent, empty, and appraising her not as a person, but as a variable in a complex equation he was already solving. "Miss Vance," he said. The words were not a greeting, they were a confirmation of data. His voice was a low baritone, smooth and utterly devoid of warmth or inflection, like stones tumbling in a deep, cold river. He did not ask her to sit. He simply watched her, his gaze sweeping over her from head to toe in a single swift inventory that made her feel stripped bare. She saw a flicker of something in his expression as his eyes lingered for a fraction of a second on her hands that were clean but not manicured, with faint ink stains under the nails and the subtle calluses of a craftsman. It was a look of cold curiosity, the way a scientist might observe an unfamiliar specimen, a detail that did not fit the expected pattern. He gestured vaguely toward the contract resting on the impossibly vast surface of his desk. "Your father has explained the arrangement?" The word hung in the air, a sterile clinical substitute for the truth of what was happening. He was not interested in her feelings, her consent, or her humanity. He was confirming the terms of a transaction. For him, this was a merger, an acquisition of a minor asset to solve a larger strategic problem. Elara felt a wave of nausea. The shame was so profound it was physical, a cold weight settling in her stomach. She was a line item in a ledger, a debt to be settled, and the man before her was the personification of the cold, ruthless script she had been handling just days before. For a moment, she thought she might faint. The city sprawled behind him, a glittering, indifferent jewel, and he was its king. And she was the tribute, the sacrifice, brought to the altar to appease a dark god. She could feel her father's desperation, her sister's fragile life, the threat of the foreclosure notice, all pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. Julian Thorne watched her struggle for composure with an unnerving stillness, his expression unreadable. He was waiting for her to break, to cry, to plead. The predictable emotional responses he had seen 1,000 times in boardrooms and hostile takeovers. He treated human emotion as a weakness to be leveraged, and he was waiting for her to reveal hers so he could end this meeting and move on. But something else rose within her. Something deeper than fear. It was a quiet, stubborn spark of defiance. The same patient strength that allowed her to spend hours mending a single torn page. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his directly for the first time. "My father," she began, her voice barely a whisper but clear and steady in the cavernous silence, "spoke of a debt of honor. It's an old-fashioned term. I was wondering if it holds any value in a world made of glass and steel." The question was not an accusation, but a genuine inquiry, a collision of her world of antiquated principles with his, of brutal pragmatism. It was the only weapon she had, to remind him that she came from a place where some things were not meant to be bought or sold. A flicker. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a tightening at the corner of his mouth, a fractional narrowing of his storm-gray eyes. He had expected tears or acquiescence, not a philosophical challenge. Her quiet dignity was an unforeseen variable. He leaned forward slightly, the first break in his controlled posture, and the predatory stillness was replaced by a focused, analytical intensity. "Honor, Miss Vance," he replied, his voice dropping to an even colder, more intimate register, "is the currency of men who have nothing else to lose. I deal in currencies that build empires, not ones that leave you begging at my door." The words were a cruel, precise scalpel intended to gut her of her foolish ideals and put her back in her place. Yet, as the words settled between them, something shifted in the charged air. His calculated cruelty had failed to extinguish the light in her eyes. Instead, it had illuminated the profound chasm of his own emptiness. For the first time, Ilara saw past the power and the wealth to the desolate landscape within him. She saw a man so wounded by the past that he had walled himself inside a fortress of cynicism. And he, in turn, saw in her not the naive girl he'd assumed, but a woman with a spine made of something other than ambition. In that long, silent gaze, a strange and dangerous seed was planted, a mutual fascination born not of attraction, but of a startling, unwelcome recognition of the other's fundamental nature. Finally, he looked away, breaking the spell. He tapped his desk, a gesture of finality. "The lawyers will be in touch with your father to finalize the details. You may go." It was a dismissal, cold and absolute. Ilara turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor. She did not look back, but she could feel his eyes on her, no longer just assessing an asset, but watching something he did not understand and could not immediately quantify. As the silent elevator doors closed, sealing her off from his world, she carried the chilling imprint of his presence with her. The horrifying arrangement had been sealed, but what terrified her more was the faint, treacherous whisper in her soul that had been strangely, terrifyingly intrigued by the monster on the throne. Her new life began in silence. Julian Thorne's penthouse was less a home and more a museum of emptiness. A vast, sterile expanse of black marble, chrome, and glass suspended 1,000 feet above the city. Ilara moved through its cavernous rooms like a ghost, her soft footsteps swallowed by the thick, sound-dampening rugs. Her presence felt like a violation, a smudge of organic life on a pristine, inorganic surface. An entire wing was designated as hers, complete with a walk-in closet filled with clothes in her size, garments chosen by a stranger, fabrics she had never felt, styles she would never have chosen. Each item was a reminder that she was not a person here, but a role to be filled, an asset that had been acquired and was now being appropriately outfitted for its new function in his portfolio of possessions. She saw him rarely in those first few days. Julian was a phantom in his own domain, a fleeting presence marked only by the low hum of his private elevator in the morning, and the faint scent of expensive, sterile cologne that lingered in the hallway after he was gone. He was a creature of schedules and unseen obligations, his life a series of closed-door meetings and digital transactions that reverberated across the globe. His absence was a deliberate and powerful statement of control. It taught her the geography of her cage, allowing her to feel the full, suffocating weight of its gilded bars. She was left alone with the city lights that glittered like a cold, distant galaxy outside her window, a constant, silent testament to the immensity of the world he commanded, and the infinitesimal smallness of her place within it. Her only solace was a small, climate-controlled library she discovered tucked away behind a featureless wall panel. It was the only room in the penthouse that felt alive, the air rich with the familiar, comforting scent of aged leather and paper. Unlike the rest of the space, it was personal, its shelves filled not with decorative bindings, but with a curated history of human thought, philosophy, classical literature, and worn volumes on military strategy. It was a map of a complex, formidable mind. She would spend hours there, running her fingers over the spines, feeling a strange sense of connection to the man who was her captor. It was in this room, surrounded by the ghosts of other storytellers, that she began to sense the profound loneliness that radiated from the heart of his empire, a desolation as vast as the view from his window. He found her there one evening, long after the household staff had departed. She was carefully examining a fragile, 17th-century edition of Machiavelli's Asterix the Prince, her brow furrowed in concentration. He stood in the doorway, silent and imposing, his suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened. For a moment, he simply watched her, his expression unreadable. The sight of her, so small and utterly absorbed amidst his collection of power and cynicism, created a dissonance in the sterile order of his world. She was an anomaly he couldn't categorize, too genuine for this environment, too resilient to be a mere victim. When she finally looked up and saw him, her gasp was barely audible, but in the profound silence of the room, it echoed like a tremor, a disturbance in the cold, still atmosphere he had so carefully constructed around himself. "An interesting choice," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air between them. He walked toward her, his movements fluid and predatory. He didn't look at the book in her hands, but at her fingers, at the way she held the ancient volume with an innate, protective reverence. Most see it as a simple manual for tyrants. He stood so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the chilled air of the room. She was acutely aware of his height, the breadth of his shoulders, the sheer physical reality of him that had, until now, been an abstract threat. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic, trapped bird, as his storm-gray eyes finally met hers, holding her captive with an intensity that stripped away all her defenses. "Or a warning," she managed to reply, her voice steadier than she felt. "A warning about what happens when a man believes he must sacrifice his humanity to protect what he has built." The words hung in the air, a direct, unfiltered challenge that went far beyond the text they were discussing. She saw it then. A flicker of shock in his eyes, a momentary breach in the impenetrable fortress of his composure. He had expected fear, submission, or perhaps a clumsy attempt at seduction. He had not expected to be seen, to have his own philosophy so accurately dissected by the girl he had purchased. A strange, dangerous current passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that this was no longer a simple transaction. It was a collision of two worlds, and the impact was already beginning to shatter them both. Their dinners became a ritual of escalating tension. They would sit at opposite ends of a ridiculously long dining table, the city's glittering panorama their only audience. The food was exquisite, prepared by a private chef, but it tasted of nothing to Ilara. Every meal was an interrogation conducted in silence. She could feel his eyes on her, analytical and probing, as if he were trying to deconstruct her, to find the flaw, the angle, the leverage point. He was studying her the way he would study a competitor's balance sheet, and this cold, impersonal scrutiny was somehow more intimate and violating than any physical touch. She found herself rebelling in small, silent ways, meeting his gaze directly, refusing to look away, forcing him to be the first to break the contact. Each stare down was a small battle in a much larger, undeclared war. One evening she broke the suffocating silence. "What do you want from me, Julian?" The question was quiet, but it landed on the polished surface of the table with the force of a thrown gauntlet. He paused, his fork hovering mid-air, a flicker of surprise crossing his features before being suppressed. He had expected her to ask about her sister, about the terms of their agreement, about money. He had not expected a question about his own desires, a concept he had long ago buried under layers of pragmatism and control. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, his gaze was not purely analytical. There was a shadow of something else there, something darker and more complex, a reluctant curiosity that bordered on a hunger he refused to acknowledge, even to himself. "I want what was agreed upon," he answered, his voice clipped and precise, a retreat to the safety of their contract. "A wife who is presentable, discreet, and who fulfills her obligations without emotional complication." The words were designed to be cruel, to remind her of her status as a commodity, but they lacked their intended sting. Ilara now understood that his cruelty was a shield, a defensive mechanism as brittle and ancient as the books in his library. She saw the fear behind his control, the wound that festered beneath the scar tissue of his wealth. A dangerous thought bloomed in her mind. What would happen if she pushed past the shield? The idea was terrifying, a step into an abyss, but it was also the first taste of power she had felt since walking into his tower. The call came late one night. It was her mother, her voice thin with panic. Lily had developed a fever, and the doctors were concerned about an infection. Ilara's carefully constructed composure crumbled instantly. The penthouse, the contract, Julian, it all faded away, replaced by the raw, primal fear for her sister. She stood in the middle of the vast living room, phone pressed to her ear, trembling as she listened to the medical jargon she knew all too well. She felt a presence behind her, and turned to see Julian standing there, watching her. He had overheard. His face was a mask of cold neutrality, but his eyes were fixed on her with an unnerving, predatory focus, observing her moment of absolute vulnerability with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Without a word, he took the phone from her trembling hand. His voice, when he spoke to her mother, was calm, decisive, and utterly commanding. He didn't offer condolences or empty reassurances. He issued orders. He named the top infectious disease specialist in the country, stated that a private medical jet was being dispatched, and that Lily would be transferred to a specialized clinic by morning. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man for whom the world bends to his will. He ended the call and handed the phone back to Alara, his expression unchanged. "The situation is being managed," he said, as if discussing a minor stock fluctuation. His efficiency was both a miracle and an obscenity, a display of power so vast it could rewrite her family's fate with a single phone call. A storm of conflicting emotions raged within her. She was awash with a profound, gut-wrenching gratitude that made her feel sick to her stomach. He had, in a matter of minutes, provided a level of care and hope that her family had bled themselves dry for years to even dream of. But she also hated him for it. She hated the ease with which he wielded his power, the casual way he solved a crisis that had defined her entire existence. He had not saved her sister out of kindness. He had protected his investment. Her family's deepest trauma was just another asset for him to manage. This realization was the cruelest cage of all. Her freedom, her family's survival, was now inextricably linked to this cold, wounded man, and she was beginning to feel a terrifying, unwilling dependency on him. Days later, with Lily stable and recovering in the best facility in the country, a strange quiet settled in the penthouse. The immediate crisis had passed, leaving a vacuum filled with an even more potent tension. Ilara found herself watching Julian, not with fear, but with a morbid fascination. She observed the subtle tells he thought he concealed, the way his jaw tightened when he was on a difficult call, the brief flash of exhaustion in his eyes when he returned late at night, the solitary way he would stand by the window and stare down at the city he owned, looking not like a king on his throne, but a prisoner in his watchtower. She was beginning to see the man beneath the monster, and this discovery was far more dangerous than her initial fear of him had ever been. He, in turn, found his gaze drawn to her more and more often. He would find her curled in a chair in the library, lost in a book, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the gentle curve of her neck, and an unfamiliar, unwelcome ache would tighten in his chest. He had designed his life to be free of emotional variables, yet this quiet, resilient woman was becoming the most unpredictable and disruptive variable of all. He had bought a wife to create an illusion of stability for the outside world, but she was systematically dismantling the carefully constructed stability of his inner one. He resented her for it, for making him feel things he had long since declared dead. But his resentment was tangled with a growing, possessive desire to keep her in his orbit, to be the sole observer of her quiet light. The impending wedding, once an abstract future event, now loomed large and unavoidable. The arrival of a custom-designed wedding gown, a breathtaking creation of silk and antique lace that must have cost more than her family's house, made the reality of their union brutally concrete. Seeing it hanging in her closet, pristine and ghostly, sent a tremor of both dread and a strange, illicit thrill through her. The dress was a symbol of her surrender, the final costume for her role as Mrs. Julian Thorne. It represented the loss of her name, her body, and her future. And yet, a treacherous part of her, a part that had been starved for beauty and passion, couldn't help but admire its exquisite craftsmanship, couldn't help but imagine the moment she would wear it for him. Her dilemma was no longer simple. The clear lines between duty and desire, between prisoner and captor, had blurred into an unrecognizable landscape of gray. She had entered this arrangement to save her family, steeling herself for a sacrifice. She had expected to endure a monster, to trade her body for her sister's life and keep her soul intact. But the monster was proving to be a man, and the sacrifice was becoming something far more complicated. She was no longer just afraid of what he would do to her. She was afraid of what she was beginning to want from him. The fear was no longer about losing her virginity, but about losing control, about willingly surrendering not just her body, but the very essence of herself to the overwhelming, gravitational pull of his dark, wounded world. Standing before the floor-to-ceiling window one night, she stared at her reflection superimposed over the glittering, indifferent city. The woman looking back at her was a stranger. Her eyes held a new depth, a shadow of knowledge, and a flicker of a dangerous burgeoning fire. The quiet book restorer, who feared the world was gone. In her place was a woman on the precipice of an impossible choice. The contract demanded her submission, but her heart was beginning to whisper a far more dangerous proposition. Not to simply endure the coming night, but to meet it head-on. To walk into the heart of the storm and see if she could find the man lost within it, even if it meant being completely and utterly consumed herself. The wedding was a phantom event, a transaction witnessed by lawyers and ghosts. Now, in the cavernous master bedroom, the reality of the contract was about to be executed. Alara stood in the center of the room, a small, pale figure swallowed by the vastness of Julian's world. The space was a symphony of muted grays and blacks, cold marble underfoot, and a wall of glass that displayed the glittering, indifferent heart of the city. Her wedding dress, a cascade of antique lace and silk, felt less like a garment and more like a ghostly shroud, the final costume for her role as a sacrifice. She had been led here by a silent housekeeper and left alone, the silence amplifying the frantic, terrified drumming of her own heart. Every shadow seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the arrival of the man who now owned her. He entered without a sound, the door closing behind him with a soft, final click that sealed the room from the rest of the world. Julian was still in his impeccably tailored tuxedo, a stark figure of black and white against the room's monochromatic palette. He did not look at her immediately. His attention focused on removing his cufflinks with a detached, methodical precision. It was the gesture of a man concluding a long day of business, not a husband approaching his bride. To him, this was the final item on the day's agenda, the consummation of a merger. Alara watched, frozen, as he placed the small silver discs on a polished valet stand. He was systematically stripping away the last vestiges of the public ceremony, preparing for the private, brutal truth of their arrangement, and she felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. His jacket was next, followed by his tie, which he loosened and pulled free with a single, fluid motion. Each removed layer of clothing seemed to increase his presence in the room, making him seem larger, more primal, a predator shedding its civilized skin. Ilara's breath hitched in her throat, her body rigid with a fear so profound it felt like paralysis. Her mind raced, a chaotic whirlwind of her sister's face, her father's shame, and the cold, unforgiving words of the contract she had signed. This was the price. This was the payment in full. She had prepared herself to be an object, to dissociate, to retreat into the silent, safe fortress of her mind, and let him do what he would. It was a strategy of survival, a way to preserve the last untouched part of herself, her soul, from the coming violation. But as he turned to finally face her, his storm-gray eyes devoid of any emotion, a spark of rebellion ignited within the terror. It was the quiet, stubborn defiance of a woman who had spent her life mending what was broken. She would not be a passive page in his ledger. Her voice, when it came, was a fragile whisper that nonetheless cut through the oppressive silence. "Before you collect on your investment, Julian," she began, her words trembling but clear, "I need to know. Is this all I am to you? The final clause in a contract?" The question was a desperate, foolish gamble, a transgression against the silent submission he expected. She was demanding to be seen not as an asset, but as a person, even if only for a moment, before she was consumed. He stopped, his hand still on the buttons of his shirt. Her words had struck a place he had long thought invulnerable. He had anticipated tears, pleading, or a cold, terrified submission. He had not anticipated a direct challenge to the very foundation of his worldview. A flicker of something dark and ancient passed through his eyes, not anger, but a deep, unsettling surprise, as if a porcelain doll had suddenly spoken to him in his own language of brutal truths. He studied her, his gaze sharp and analytical, trying to understand this unexpected move. "You are precisely what we agreed you would be, Alara," he finally answered, his voice a low, cold baritone meant to extinguish her spark. "The solution to a problem, nothing more." But the words, for the first time, felt hollow, a recited defense rather than a statement of fact. He resumed his advance, crossing the space between them with a slow, deliberate purpose that made her blood run cold. Each step he took on the silent, plush carpet was a step deeper into her personal space, a relentless claiming of territory. He was immense, a towering shadow that blocked out the city lights, and his proximity was overwhelming. The air grew thick, charged with his scent, a clean, sterile mix of expensive soap and something uniquely masculine and predatory. She could feel the heat radiating from his body as he came to a stop just before her. Her entire being screamed at her to flee, to recoil, but her feet were rooted to the floor, held in place by the weight of her sacrifice. He was going to touch her, and the thought was a terrifying, paralyzing certainty. As his hand lifted, moving slowly toward the delicate lace at her shoulder, the carefully constructed walls of her composure shattered into a million pieces. The sheer, overwhelming scale of it all, the man, the room, the power, the irrevocable finality of this moment crashed down upon her. A single choked sob escaped her lips, and the words tumbled out, a raw, desperate plea from the deepest part of her soul. "Careful," she begged, her voice breaking. "Please, it's too big." The words were a fragile, trembling admission of her terror, a confession that held a universe of meaning. It was his body, yes, but it was also his world, his wealth, his coldness, the life that was about to swallow her whole. It was a plea not for him to stop, but for a shred of humanity in the face of the abyss. Her raw, terrified vulnerability was a force he had not anticipated. It pierced through decades of cynical armor and struck a nerve he thought had died long ago. Julian froze, his fingers hovering inches from her skin. In her wide, tear-filled eyes, he did not see a business asset or a contractual obligation. He saw a terrified woman on the verge of breaking, and in her brokenness, he saw a horrifying echo of his own. He saw the ghost of a young man betrayed, of a father ruined, of a life rebuilt on the principle of never, ever being vulnerable again. Her plea for him to be careful was a demand he had never allowed himself to consider. For the first time in 20 years, the cold, calculating machine inside him faltered, silenced by the undeniable, terrifying pulse of a human heart. In his hesitation, in the sudden, violent conflict she saw raging in his eyes, Elara found a strange and unexpected courage. This was her moment of true transgression, not against him, but against her own fear. She did not shrink away from his suspended hand. Instead, she leaned into the space between them, an infinitesimal movement of profound surrender. Her gaze never left his, and in that shared look, she offered him the one thing he had never been given, a choice. She was not just a victim to be taken. She was a woman offering a trust so absolute it was terrifying. Seeing this, something inside him broke. The predatory stillness dissolved, replaced by a raw, uncertain hesitation. He was no longer the master of this transaction. He was a man lost in a wilderness he had forgotten existed. When he finally touched her, it was not with the cold possession she had braced for. His touch was shockingly gentle, his fingertips tracing the line of her collarbone with a reverence that felt like a question. It was the touch of a man rediscovering a forgotten language. In response, Elara closed her eyes, a silent tear tracing a path down her cheek. The consummation that followed was not an execution of a clause. It was a collision of two deeply wounded souls in the vast, silent darkness. It was painful and clumsy and terrifying, but it was threaded with an impossible, fragile tenderness that neither of them had expected. As the first light of dawn began to bleed over the city, they lay entangled in the wreckage of their carefully constructed worlds, two strangers bound not by a contract, but by the terrifying, undeniable truth of a shared vulnerability. The first light of dawn was a sterile gray knife, slicing through the panoramic window and illuminating the vast emptiness of the master bedroom. Elara awoke to a profound silence, a stillness so absolute it felt like the aftermath of a cataclysm. She was alone. The space beside her in the impossibly large bed was cold, the sheets smooth and undisturbed, as if he had never been there at all. It was a chilling, deliberate erasure of the night's events. The physical ache between her legs was a dull, persistent reminder of her lost virginity, but it was overshadowed by a deeper, more hollow ache in her soul. The room, once a symbol of his power and her impending doom, now felt like a tomb, consecrated by a shared vulnerability that its owner had already fled, leaving her as the sole ghost to haunt the scene of the crime. Her gaze fell upon the nightstand, and her breath caught. Resting there, its gilt spine catching the morning light, was a perfectly restored, first-edition copy of Wuthering Heights, the very book she had once mentioned loving during a fleeting, almost forgotten conversation in his library. It was an impossible, anonymous gesture. She reached out with a trembling hand, her restorer's fingertips tracing the flawless tooling of the leather binding. An act of craftsmanship she understood intimately. But the motive behind it was an alien language. Was this a gift of contrition, a flicker of understanding, or was it something colder? A payment rendered, a final, calculated acquisition to close the account of the night before? The book was both a bridge and a wall, an acknowledgement of her soul and a brutal reminder that he could and would simply purchase the things she held sacred. Miles away in the sterile silence of his pre-dawn office, Julian Thorne stood before his own wall of glass, a mirror image of Alara's vigil. He wasn't looking at the city he commanded. He was seeing her. The memory of her raw, terrified plea, "Careful, it's too big," was a shard of glass in his mind. He had spent 2 decades building an empire on the bedrock of absolute control, meticulously eliminating every emotional variable, every potential weakness. Yet in one night, this quiet, fragile woman had breached every defense with the sheer force of her vulnerability. His uncharacteristic gentleness, a response he hadn't known he was capable of, now felt like a catastrophic failure of protocol. He felt exposed, compromised. His immediate, instinctual reaction was to retreat, to rebuild the walls, to bury the memory under the cold, hard logic of business, and reaffirm the terms of their contract in his own mind. The days that followed were an exercise in calculated distance, a masterclass in psychological warfare conducted through silence. Julian became a phantom in his own home. Ilara would hear the distant thrum of his helicopter departing from the roof in the morning, and the soft chime of his private elevator late at night, but she never saw him. The vast penthouse, once just intimidating, now felt actively hostile, its empty spaces echoing with his deliberate absence. The household staff moved around her with a new, unnerving deference, their eyes filled with a pity she couldn't bear. This was not the peaceful solitude of her old workshop. It was a weaponized silence, designed to isolate her, to remind her of her place, and to punish her for the intimacy he was now determined to pretend had never happened. He was trying to erase her, and she was beginning to fear he would succeed. A confusing and corrosive guilt began to eat at her. She replayed the climax of their wedding night endlessly, dissecting her own actions. Had her plea been a form of manipulation? Had she used her virginity, her terror, as a tool to disarm him, to force a humanity from him that he had not intended to give? A deep, unsettling shame washed over her, not for the act itself, but for the fragile, tender connection it had forged. It felt like she had stolen something precious and illicit from a man who hoarded his emotions like treasure. She feared she hadn't just broken the seal of her own body, but had fractured the very foundation of his carefully constructed world. She had seen the man behind the monster, and now she was terrified that the monster would re-emerge to punish her for that unforgivable transgression. Her isolation was solidified by a phone call home. Her mother's voice was unnaturally bright, filled with news of Lily's remarkable progress at the new clinic. She spoke of world-class doctors and cutting-edge treatments with a breathless gratitude that was painful for Alara to hear. But the conversation was a minefield of unspoken truths. Her mother asked if the penthouse was comfortable, if the staff was attentive, but she never asked the one question that mattered. "Are you okay?" Ilara understood the silent contract with her family was as binding as the one with Julian. They had to accept the miracle of Lily's health without ever acknowledging the sacrifice that had purchased it. She was their savior, but she was also a ghost to them now, irrevocably severed from their world by the very act that had saved it. Yet in the heart of this gilded prison, a strange and unexpected seed of strength began to germinate. The terror of that night, which she thought would shatter her, had instead forged something new within her. She had survived the ultimate surrender. She had faced the abyss and had not been consumed entirely. More than that, she had looked into the eyes of the predator and had seen a flicker of his own profound wounds. That knowledge was a secret, a source of dangerous and potent power. She began to move through the penthouse, not as a captive, but as an observer. She read Julian's books on philosophy and strategy, not as an escape, but as reconnaissance, learning the architecture of his mind, preparing for a battle she was only now beginning to understand. One afternoon she caught her reflection in a large, frameless mirror in the main gallery and stopped, truly seeing herself for the first time since the wedding. The woman looking back was not the timid girl who had walked into this tower. The fear in her eyes was still there, but it was now overlaid with a shadow of resilience, a quiet, knowing depth. Her posture was different, her shoulders straighter, as if they had accepted a new and significant weight. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. That night had been a transgression not just against her body, but against the very cage of her own fear. She had been broken open, and in the breaking, she was discovering a strength she never knew she possessed. The world was still too big, but she was no longer quite so small. Julian, meanwhile, was engaged in his own form of suffering. He drove his company with a renewed, almost manic ruthlessness, orchestrating hostile takeovers and crushing competitors with a cold fury that unnerved even his most seasoned executives. He was trying to drown the memory of Alara in the familiar, controllable chaos of the market. But she was a persistent ghost. He would see her quiet reverence in the way an analyst presented data. He would hear her whispered plea in the silence between negotiations. He was haunted by the feeling of her absolute trust, a gift he knew he was unworthy of. He had built his entire life as a fortress against the very vulnerability she had offered him so freely, and now her presence in his mind was a constant, silent siege against the walls he had thought were impenetrable. The oppressive silence that stretched between them in the penthouse could not last. It had become a tangible entity, a vacuum growing heavier and more unstable with each passing day, pulling everything toward its inevitable collapse. Standing by the window one evening, the city lights a cold fire beneath her, Ilara felt a sense of clarity settle over her. Their contract had been irrevocably altered. The transaction had become a connection, a shared wound that bound them more tightly than any legal document. Her fear of him was being replaced by a sharp, clear-eyed curiosity. A confrontation was coming. She was no longer simply the price he had paid to solve a problem. She was the unforeseen consequence, a variable he could not control, and a part of her, a part that was newly, dangerously alive, was ready for the storm. The oppressive silence of the penthouse had become a living thing, a predator that stalked the vast, empty rooms and fed on her solitude. But Alara had come to understand that this silence was not an absence of sound. It was a weapon, and Julian was wielding it with devastating precision. She would not be its victim. Carrying the first-edition copy of Wuthering Heights like a shield, she walked with a newfound deliberate purpose toward the one room in this sterile fortress that held any semblance of a soul, his library. She was no longer the terrified girl from their wedding night. That girl had been sacrificed, and from the ashes, someone else had emerged. A woman who understood that the only way to survive in his world was to learn its brutal language and speak a truth he could not ignore or dismiss. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but it was not the frantic beat of fear. It was the steady, powerful rhythm of a coming war. The journey through the silent expanse of the penthouse felt like a pilgrimage across a foreign and hostile landscape. Her bare feet were silent on the cold, polished marble of the main gallery, a stark contrast to the echoing emptiness of the space. Each piece of minimalist art on the walls seemed to watch her, their abstract forms like cold, judgmental eyes. She passed the dining room table where they had waged their silent wars over untouched meals, and the living area where she had received the panicked call about her sister. Every corner of this place was a monument to their fractured, transactional relationship. When she reached the heavy, soundproof door of his library, she paused, her hand hovering over the cold metal handle. She was about to willingly step back into the heart of the storm, not as a piece of debris, but as a force of nature in her own right. He was there, standing with his back to her, a dark silhouette against the floor-to-ceiling window that framed the sprawling, indifferent city. He was not the titan of industry she had first met, nor the cold husband who had left her alone in the dawn. In the dim light of the library, stripped of his suit jacket, he looked weary, his shoulders carrying an invisible weight that seemed heavier than his entire empire. He did not turn as she entered, but she saw his posture stiffen, a subtle, almost imperceptible tensing that told her he had been aware of her approach the entire time. She walked softly until she stood a few feet behind him, the charged silence between them, humming with everything that had been left unsaid. The book in her hands felt impossibly heavy, a tangible piece of evidence of the crime of their shared vulnerability, and she was here to present it at his trial. "I came to return this," she said, her voice quiet but clear, refusing to tremble. He turned slowly, his storm-gray eyes finally meeting hers. They were shadowed with exhaustion and a deep, guarded pain. His gaze dropped to the book she held out to him. "I needed to know," she continued, her words precise, a scalpel to his carefully constructed defenses. Was this a payment for services rendered? Or was it a confession? The question hung in the air, a direct strike at the ambiguity that had tortured her. For a long moment, he said nothing, the battle raging behind his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, stripped of its usual cold command. "It was a warning," he admitted, the words costing him more than any billion-dollar deal. "A warning to myself, that I was in the presence of something authentic, and that I would inevitably destroy it, just like everything else I touch." His admission was not an apology, but it was something far more profound. It was the truth. It was the key to the fortress, the code to the man. The predatory power he projected was gone, replaced by the raw, unshielded vulnerability of the wounded man she had sensed all along. A wave of understanding, so powerful it was almost painful, washed over her. He had pushed her away not out of cruelty, but out of a deep-seated, terrified belief in his own toxicity. He saw himself as a blight, and she was the one pure, untouched thing that had ever entered his sterile world. He was trying to protect her from himself. In this shared, silent acknowledgement of his own brokenness, the entire foundation of their relationship shifted from a cold contract into a fragile, terrifyingly real connection between two profoundly damaged souls. He took a hesitant step toward her, closing the small distance between them. The air crackled, no longer with fear and submission, but with a new, uncertain current of possibility. He didn't reach for her, but his eyes held hers, a silent plea for an absolution he didn't believe he deserved. And Alara, the quiet restorer of broken things, understood her purpose. Her work had never been about just mending paper and leather. It was about preserving the story within. And here, before her, was the most complex, damaged, and valuable story she had ever encountered. The future was an unwritten page, terrifying and vast, but for the first time, she felt ready to pick up the pen. If you believe that even the most broken stories deserve a chance at a new beginning, show your support by subscribing, liking, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below.